Her name was Priya, 29 years old. She worked as an occupational therapist at a rehabilitation center in Charlotte, North Carolina, doing intake assessments and mobility evaluations for patients recovering from strokes and orthopedic surgeries. It was careful, attentive work, the kind that required her to be completely present with other people for hours at a stretch. And by the time her shift ended, she was spent in a way that had nothing to do with physical effort. Running was how she reset. It was the one part of the day that asked nothing of her except to move. She'd been using the Greenway trail off of Park Road for almost 2 full years by the time this happened. 4 mornings a week, alarm at 5:50, out the door by 6. On the trail by 6:15. She ran 3.5 miles, always the same loop, always alone. She knew every section of that path the way you know a room you've lived in for years, not by looking at it, but by the feel of it underfoot. She knew where the asphalt went slightly soft after rain. She knew the bench at the halfway point with the carved initials, 2 sets of them, overlapping, which she'd always found quietly interesting. She knew the 2 spots where the tree roots had buckled the surface, and you had to step just to the right to avoid a twisted ankle. She knew exactly how long each section took at her current pace, which meant she always knew, without checking her watch, where she was in the loop dot. It was a Wednesday in October. Not quite dawn when she started. The trail lights were on those amber-tinted ones that make the path look slightly yellow, and everything else looked dark, and there was a chill in the air, sharp enough that she could see her own breath in small clouds that dissolved behind her. She had a podcast going, something about true crime, which in retrospect she finds grimly funny. She was wearing her usual gear, black leggings, a long-sleeved top, her older running shoes, because the new ones were still breaking in on shorter runs. She had her running watch, but not her phone. She'd started leaving her phone in the car because the watch tracked everything she needed, and the phone just felt like extra weight and an excuse to stop and look at it. She was maybe a mile in, well into her rhythm, when she passed the bench at the halfway rest point. There was a man sitting on it, just sitting. No phone, no water bottle, no other gear that she could see. He was facing the trail, not turned toward the river or looking at his watch or doing anything in particular. His posture was relaxed, both hands resting on his knees, looking in the direction of oncoming runners. She registered him the way you register any feature of a familiar path, briefly, automatically, and then gone. She figured he was waiting for a running partner. Maybe he'd arrived early. Maybe he was resting between intervals. She moved past him without slowing down, and by the time she'd gone another 100 yards, she'd already moved on to whatever the podcast was saying. She didn't think about him again for about 4 minutes. That was how long it took before she heard footsteps behind her. They came in gradually, not suddenly behind her, but growing like they'd been there a while and were only now registering. She pulled her left earbud out just to calibrate. She could hear them clearly in the quiet. Morning air, steady rhythm, medium weight, keeping consistent pace. The trail at that hour was silent enough that you could hear the difference between a runner's footfall and a walker's, the way a runner's weight shifts forward, the slightly different compression of shoe on asphalt. These were a runner's footsteps. She glanced back over her shoulder as naturally as she could manage the man from the bench. He was maybe 40 feet behind her, jogging at what looked like a comfortable, sustainable pace. No earbuds, no water, no watch that she could see. And he was looking straight ahead, which happened to be directly at her back. She put her earbud back in and told herself this was nothing. People sit on benches and watch the trail. They see someone running at a manageable pace, and they decide to go. She'd probably given him the idea just by running past. That was a completely ordinary thing to happen, and she was not the kind of person who treated every man on a running trail as a potential threat. She'd been running alone for years without incident. She wasn't going to start catastrophizing. Now, she ran for another minute, maybe 90 seconds. Then she pulled the earbud out again. The footsteps were closer. Not dramatically, so it wasn't like he'd broken into a sprint, but they were closer than they'd been. She did a rough mental calculation. If she hadn't slowed down, the gap had shrunk, which meant he'd sped up. She couldn't confirm this without looking back again, and she didn't want to make it obvious that she was checking on him. She lengthened her stride instead, trying to open the gap without making it seem intentional. The footsteps kept pace. She moved to the far right of the trail, the etiquette move, the signal that she was giving someone room to pass. She held there for 30 seconds, giving him a clear lane on her left. She kept her eyes forward. She listened for the change in his footfall pattern that would mean he was accelerating to pass her. He didn't pass. He stayed exactly where he was behind her dot. There was a moment, a very specific moment she'd remember later, where she consciously decided not to be afraid. She told herself, "You are a woman running alone, and you are conditioning yourself to see threats that aren't there. He's just a runner. You moved over. He's probably not in a hurry. You're fine." She put both earbuds back in, turned the volume up slightly, and kept going, but her shoulders had gone tight. Her jaw was clenched. Her body was doing something her brain hadn't authorized, and she'd learned enough over the years to understand that the body sometimes knows before the brain catches up, and that dismissing it as irrational doesn't make it wrong. She noted details without turning around. The sound of his footsteps told her he was still there, still at approximately the same distance, matching her speed adjustments, the way a shadow matches movement, not gaining aggressively, not falling back, just holding position, which told her this was intentional and measured, and that he had done some version of this before. She tried one more variation, dropping her pace slightly, the way you do when you want to let someone pass, and held it for a full minute. Nothing changed. He wasn't going to pass. She knew this stretch of trail well enough to know what was coming. The section she'd privately named the tunnel. It was where the tree canopy closed completely overhead, dense enough that even at noon in summer, it dimmed the light. The trail lights in that section were spaced further apart than anywhere else on the loop, and in October, with the leaves still mostly on the branches, it was genuinely dark at 6:20 in the morning. It was also the most isolated part of the path. No sight lines to the street, no adjacent parking areas, the river on one side and dense tree growth on the other. No other runners used it consistently at this hour. She knew this because she had been on it alone dozens of times. She ran toward it and decided, in the last 20 feet before the entrance, that she wasn't going in. She stopped, stepped off the asphalt, turned all the way around, both earbuds out. He was about 20 feet away. He'd slowed when she stopped. He was standing now, not jogging, and he was breathing in a way that was completely even, not the labored breathing of someone who'd been running, more like someone standing still. His hands were at his sides. He was not looking at the ground, or the sky, or anything around him. He was looking at her, directly, without any of the social awkwardness that a normal person would feel at being caught staring. She said it loudly. "I forgot something. I'm heading back." She said it the way you say something you want overheard, with more volume than the conversation required, in case anyone else was within range. He didn't answer. He didn't move. He didn't blink that she could see. She turned and started walking, back the way she'd come, quickly. Not running. She didn't want to turn her back on him while running. Didn't want him to know exactly how fast she could go, but moving. She kept him in her peripheral vision for as long as she could. She heard him step off the path. The sound was unmistakable. The specific crunch of leaves and dry grass that's different from asphalt. Off the trail, into the tree line on the right. Not behind her anymore. to the side and moving parallel. She ran, not jogging, running, the kind where your form falls apart and your arms do things they're not supposed to do, the kind you can't maintain for long, but don't need to, the kind your body produces automatically when it has decided that efficiency is less important than distance. The amber lights strobed past. The asphalt was loud under her feet. She could hear her own breathing, sharp, ugly, nothing like her training rhythm. She could hear the sound of the trail. She could not hear footsteps behind her. That was somehow worse. A branch snapped. Left. Side. Close she didn't look. Running parallel to the trail through dense trees at this pace would mean broken undergrowth and low branches. She could hear them. She fixed her eyes on the parking lot light pale, yellow through the branches ahead, and she ran at it. Something moved in her peripheral vision. Left side, level with her, keeping pace through the trees. She couldn't get a clear read on distance. Couldn't tell if she was seeing a person or a shadow or a deer or her own panic turning darkness into shapes. She didn't slow down to find out. The lot appeared. Gravel crackling under her feet. The yellow light overhead. Her car, exactly where she'd parked it, 2 spaces from the trailhead entrance. She got the key fob out of her waistband. She'd learned to carry it there after years of running, and she aimed it at the car. Her hands were shaking badly enough that her aim was off. She hit the button twice. The locks clicked. She got in. She hit the interior lock, all doors, and then she hit the engine and turned all the lights on. She sat there, engine running, and looked at the trailhead in her rearview mirror. Nobody came out. She noticed the other car then. A beige or tan sedan. She couldn't confirm the color in the amber light, parked 3 spaces to her left. She hadn't noticed it when she arrived. The front of it was facing away from her, and she could not see a license plate on the back from this angle. She drove out of the lot and went to the nearest gas station, 2 miles up the road, and called her husband from the clerk's phone because she didn't trust herself to drive farther than that without talking to someone first. She reported it that same morning, first to the Parks Department's non-emergency line, then to Charlotte Mecklenburg Police. They took the report. They told her there had been no other complaints specifically about that trail section, though they noted that lighting conditions in the tunnel area had been flagged before and were under review. They asked for a physical description of the man. Medium height, she said. Dark jacket, navy or black, she wasn't sure. Age maybe late 30s to mid-40s, though she acknowledged she could be off by 10 years in either direction because of the light. No other distinguishing features she could pin down clearly. She'd been too focused on reading his behavior to catalog his appearance, which is exactly what happens and is nobody's fault. A patrol car drove the trail within the hour. Nothing found. No one matching her description. The beige sedan was gone by the time anyone thought to look for it, and there was no camera covering that particular parking area. Her husband went back with her 2 days later, in daylight, to walk the trail. She wanted to look at the bench. She stood in front of it for a long time without saying anything. From that bench, she calculated, you could see the trailhead clearly. You could watch people arrive, see which direction they went, observe the pace they settled into. You could watch for 15 minutes and have a very good sense of whether someone was a solo runner, how fast they moved, and whether they had a phone in their hand. The bench was positioned at a natural rest point with a garbage can beside it and a water fountain 10 feet away. Nobody would think twice about a person sitting there. What she kept turning over in the weeks after was not the man stepping into the trees, not the sounds she may or may not have heard running beside her. What bothered her most was the bench. The way he had been sitting there facing the trail when she arrived, not doing anything, not holding anything, not in any posture that suggested he had just finished a run or was about to start one. Just sitting, waiting, already there, before she pulled into the parking lot, before she laced her shoes, before her run had even begun. She thought about how many mornings she had passed that bench at 6:15. How predictable that was. How visible her routine must have been to anyone who had taken the time to observe it. Maybe more than once, maybe across many mornings, quietly cataloging a stranger's schedule with a patience that she found, in retrospect, more disturbing than anything else about that day. She still runs. Different trail on the other side of the city. Different time she goes at 7:30 now, when it is properly light, and always with a running partner she coordinates with the night before. She says she does not miss the solo morning runs. She says it with the practiced ease of someone who has worked very hard to believe it. Marcus taught high school history in Boise, Idaho. He'd been at the same school for 9 years, coached junior varsity soccer, and had a reputation among his students for being the kind of teacher who actually learned your name by the second week. He was a big guy, 6'2", broad, the kind of person who looks like he'd be hard to intimidate, which is something he'd reflect on later, when he was trying to explain why he dismissed his instincts for as long as he did. He'd started running about 3 months before this happened. Not because he was particularly passionate about it, but because his doctor had flagged his blood pressure at his annual physical and suggested sustained cardio as a first intervention before looking at medication. His wife bought him a training app. He followed the plan. He was proud of that. He talked about it at school, told his students he was working toward a half marathon, which was true, and lost 11 pounds in the first 2 months, which he was also not shy about mentioning. He used the Boise River Greenbelt, a paved trail that runs for miles along the river through the middle of the city. It was popular and well used, which was part of the appeal. He ran it 5 evenings a week after school, usually starting around 5:30. By October, the light was getting shorter, but there was still a reasonable amount of daylight left when he finished, usually around 6:30 or a little after. He ran with his phone in an armband case, wireless earbuds, a water bottle clipped to a small running belt. He had a regular route, out 3 miles, turn around at a footbridge he liked, back 3 miles. He'd done it so many times he could have navigated it without looking up. He was about 3 miles in just reaching his turnaround point when he passed a woman coming from the opposite direction. She was running at a decent pace, athletic build, dark athletic gear, hair up. She glanced at him when they passed, which was completely normal. Then she looked back over her shoulder at him. He figured she'd recognized him. He taught a lot of kids in this city, and parents sometimes double-took when they spotted him out of context. He thought nothing of it, rounded the footbridge, and headed back. 4 minutes into his return leg, she passed him again, going the same direction he was. He noticed immediately, because his pace hadn't dropped. If she'd been running ahead of him and he'd caught her, he would have passed her. She'd been moving faster than him when he saw her originally, which meant she'd turned around at some point after they'd passed and come back. That happened on trails. You hit a landmark or a distance target, you reverse. Nothing about it required explanation. She fell in just behind him, not beside him, not accelerating to pass behind him, maybe 12 feet back, settling into that position, the way water settles into a level. He could hear her footfalls clearly over his reduced earbud volume. Litter, quicker cadence than his, very consistent. He was already on edge in a way he couldn't precisely name, and the consistency bothered him more than he could immediately. Articulate most runners vary their pace when they're running naturally, responding to their own body, their own fatigue. Her footfall pattern had the regularity of someone maintaining a target, not just running. He ran for about 2 minutes. She was still there, at the same distance. He slowed to take a water break, unclipped the bottle from his belt, drank, recapped. He did it naturally, unhurried, the way he'd done it 100 times on this trail. When he glanced back in a way that could have been checking his surroundings, she had slowed too. She was standing about 15 feet behind him. She had her phone out, and she was looking at the screen. She wasn't drinking anything, wasn't stretching, wasn't checking her shoe, or catching her breath. She was paused, phone in hand, waiting. He told himself she was checking her pace data. He started running. She started running. He varied his speed, pushed up to a pace that should have forced a pass or opened the gap, and held it for 45 seconds. The gap didn't change. He replayed the sequence. She'd passed him going the opposite direction. She'd glanced back. She'd reversed and positioned herself behind him. She'd mirrored his water stop. She'd matched his speed variations. Each individual item on that list was explainable. He kept trying to hold all of them together and arrive at an innocent conclusion. He couldn't get there. He took a sharp right at the next fork without signaling or slowing the sharp kind of turn that breaks your stride pattern and would be difficult to mirror without preparation. It was a connector trail he'd run maybe 4 or 5 times, less groomed than the main greenbelt, leading toward a small overflow parking area that was usually empty on weekday evenings. It was not on his planned route. He took it as a test. He heard her footsteps turn right behind him. His mouth went dry. The connector trail narrowed here, with denser tree cover on both sides and a surface that was gravel rather than paved, which made both of their footsteps louder and changed the sound of the whole environment. The river traffic noise faded. The ambient city sounds faded. It was quieter than the main greenbelt in a way that felt specific and isolating. He kept his pace steady and ran through the rationalization one more time. Maybe she uses this connector. Maybe she parks in the overflow lot. Maybe this is a series of coincidences that looks like a pattern, but isn't one. And you are a large, physically imposing man who is frightened of a woman who weighs probably half what you do, and that is both embarrassing and absurd. He ran that reasoning for about 40 seconds. He almost landed on it. Then he fumbled his phone dot. It caught the edge of the armband at a bad angle, skittered off the gravel, and came to rest in the long grass at the trail's edge. He stopped and crouched down to find it, pushing the grass aside. When he stood and turned around, she was close, 10 feet, maybe less. She had stopped running completely. She was walking toward him slowly, with the deliberate pace of someone who no longer needs to maintain the pretense of coincidence. Her phone was out, and she was looking at the screen, but her face was level, eyes up, fixed on him. He said it clearly, without aggression, but without softness. "Hey, can I help you with something?" She stopped. A pause 1 second, maybe too long. Enough to feel calculated, and then she said, "Sorry, wrong trail," turned and walked quickly back toward the fork. She didn't look back. Within 30 seconds, she'd gone around the corner, and he couldn't hear her anymore. He stood there on the gravel, phone in his wet hand, listening to the quiet of the connector trail. She'd said a perfectly ordinary sentence and left. There was nothing illegal about what she'd done. He couldn't describe what was wrong with it. He could only feel it, the kind of wrong that sits in your chest rather than your head. He looked at his phone screen. There was a notification he hadn't seen before. A location sharing request from a third-party app he did not recognize and had no record of downloading. Sent. He pressed the timestamp to confirm 3 minutes and 42 seconds ago, while she was running directly behind him. While she was close enough that he could hear each footfall individually. He stared at it. He did not accept the request. His phone buzzed. Same number, a text message. One word, his first name, spelled correctly. He stopped breathing for a moment. The trail was absolutely quiet. The kind of quiet that a trail gets when the ambient noise of the city is blocked on all sides by dense tree cover, and the sound of the river isn't enough to fill it. The quiet of a space that has been reduced to just you and whatever else is in it. He was alone on a connector path he had turned onto deliberately to test a theory, and the theory had just been confirmed in a way he had not prepared for. Someone had sent a location request to his phone while standing close enough to hear him breathe, and then sent his name. He put the phone in his pocket. He started moving. Not sprinting, not yet, but fast, deliberate, back the way he'd come toward the main greenbelt. His phone buzzed again in his pocket. He didn't look at it. The connector trail was dim under the tree cover, the gravel pale in the failing light. The river was audible to his left, that constant white noise hiss that had always been part of the background of this run, and now felt like something designed to cover other sounds. He heard voices. Male voices. Plural. 2, possibly 3. Somewhere in the tree line to his right, 15 or 20 feet off the trail. Not on the path. In the trees, moving at roughly his pace. He could not see anyone. He ran. Full pace. No thought to form or stride or the training schedule he'd been following carefully for 6 weeks. The gravel was loud under his feet. The voices behind him did not get louder, but they did not fade either, which meant whoever was back. There was also moving, and had no reason to hide it. He broke out onto the main greenbelt. Open lit. A couple walking a dog maybe 30 yards ahead, a cyclist coming the other direction. The ordinary populated world, exactly as he'd left it. He nearly ran into the couple. He didn't stop to apologize. He kept going all the way to the trailhead, crossed the parking lot, and got into his truck. He sat there with the engine running and all 4 doors locked for 15 minutes. He checked his phone. 3 more messages from the same number. He did not read them. He screenshotted the entire thread, declined the location request, and blocked the number. His hands left sweat prints on the steering wheel that were still visible when he got home. He filed a report with the Boise Police Department that night. The number traced to a prepaid VoIP line with no registered user, which the officer told him was unfortunately common in cases like this. The officer's phrasing "cases like this" implied this wasn't the first time they'd heard something similar. But he didn't ask for clarification, and she didn't offer it. He talked to an IT contact who worked in cybersecurity. The location request had been sent through a legitimate app that shouldn't have been on his phone. It had no record in his App Store download history, which his friend described as unusual but not impossible, suggesting either a very specific exploit or that someone had had physical access to his device. He hadn't let anyone touch his phone that day. He'd had it in the armband case the entire run, the whole time she was behind him, the whole time she was close enough that he could hear her footfalls. His IT contact pointed out something else. The location request had included a pre-filled display name, a female name he didn't recognize, one that suggested whoever had set this up had built a profile, had prepared for the interaction, had expected to be close enough to him for long enough that an accepted ping would tell them something useful, not a random crime of opportunity. Something planned. He factory reset the phone, got a new number. He told his wife everything, which he says was the hardest part, not because she didn't believe him, but because she did, immediately, without question. And then neither of them said anything for a long time. They sat at the kitchen table in silence, and he stared at his hands and thought about the voices in the trees. He still runs the Greenbelt. He goes on Saturday mornings now, with a group he found through a local running club. He keeps his phone in his hand rather than in the armband. He has not gone near the connector trail since, the thing he comes back to, still more than anything else. The text contained his first name, spelled correctly. He has a common first name, yes, but there was no public social media account linking his face to it. No app on his phone that would display it externally. No searchable directory with his photo. Whoever sent that message knew who he was before they ever got on the trail behind him, which means they'd found that out somewhere else, at some other time, in some way he has never been able to trace. Renata was a freelance graphic designer, logo work, brand identity, the occasional marketing campaign for a local brewery or a restaurant relaunch, and she worked from a home studio in Savannah, Georgia. She'd moved there 8 months before this. Happened, a fresh start after a difficult divorce. Choosing Savannah because she'd visited once years ago and loved the light there, the Spanish moss hanging from the live oaks, the particular way the city felt like it had depth to it, like it was layered over something older that hadn't entirely gone away. She describes that feeling differently now. Running had been her way of learning the city. Every few weeks, she'd pick a different route, a different neighborhood, and go explore. She kept notes in a small journal, not about the runs themselves, but about what she found. A coffee shop she hadn't expected, tucked into a converted house on a street that didn't appear on most maps. A section of wrought iron fence that looked hand-forged and impractical and entirely beautiful. An overgrown lot with a fig tree that nobody seemed to have claimed, loaded with fruit in September that she never took because she wasn't sure she was allowed to. It was, she admits, a little bit precious. She was trying to fall in love with a new city, and she was being deliberate about it, building familiarity on purpose, trail by trail, neighborhood by neighborhood, treating each new route as something to be learned and remembered and returned to. She had not considered at that time that being legible and predictable in a new city could be a liability as well as a comfort. The trail she'd recently started using was a converted rail corridor on the east side of the city, an old freight line that the Parks Department had paved, over and landscaped with native plantings and intervals of southern live oak. It was beautiful in a way that felt almost excessive, especially in the late afternoon when the light came through the canopy sideways and turned the air gold. She'd found it by accident while driving around one Sunday, and she'd been going twice a week since, always around 4:30 or 5 o'clock. She preferred it quiet. She usually saw a handful of other runners and the occasional dog walker, but it wasn't heavily trafficked, which was part of the appeal. She ran with one earbud in, one out of habit she'd developed after reading something about situational awareness, and she kept her phone in her hand rather than pocketed. She was about 20 minutes into her run, maybe 2 miles in, when she noticed. The dog got large, mixed breed, reddish-brown coat, compact, muscular body. No leash, no collar she could see, wandering in the middle of the trail with the meandering, unfocused energy of a dog that had been outside for a while without direction. She slowed down. She'd been bitten badly once in her 20s, a neighbor's dog, and she had a standing policy of giving unknown dogs a wide berth. She moved to the far left of the trail and passed the dog slowly. It watched her without aggression. When she was level with it, it sat down. She found that charming, actually. She kept going. About 14 minutes later, she passed a man coming from the opposite direction. He was jogging at an easy pace, casual, dressed in gray athletic gear. He asked, almost in passing, "Hey, did you see a big red dog back there?" She said yes, about a quarter mile, sitting on the trail. He thanked her, gave a short laugh, the embarrassed laugh of a dog owner who'd lost track of their animal, and kept jogging. She kept jogging. She didn't think about it again until she turned around at her usual halfway point, a picnic shelter with a water fountain and a trash can, and started heading back. She would have passed them. That was the thing. On a trail with no visible side exits for the quarter mile between the shelter and where she'd last seen the man and the dog, she should have encountered both of them, the dog first, then the man coming the other direction. The trail was straight, enough in that section that she'd have seen them from 30 or 40 yards out. She didn't see either of them. She slowed to a walk briefly and looked around. The trail was empty in both directions. The tree line on either side was dense, but there was a fence running behind it. Or there was supposed to be. She seemed to remember a chain-link fence visible through the trunks when the light caught it right. Maybe there was a gate she'd missed. Maybe they'd gone off into a maintenance access or a gap she hadn't noticed. Maybe the man had turned back earlier than she realized, and she'd calculated the timing wrong. These were all reasonable explanations. She filed them and kept going. The smell hit her maybe 10 minutes later. She'd describe it afterward as petroleum-based. Something between motor oil and an industrial solvent with a sharpness underneath it she couldn't precisely place. She noticed it the way you notice a smell when it's out of context briefly, with a small flicker of question, and then moved through it, assuming there was a maintenance vehicle parked nearby or some kind of service access she couldn't see. The smell faded after about 30 seconds. She ran on. Then she rounded a gentle curve in the trail, and the dog was their same dog. Same reddish-brown coat, same compact, muscular frame, same size. It was standing in the center of the trail ahead of her, facing her direction, ears slightly forward. This time it had a leash, a long red nylon leash, the kind you buy at any pet supply store, attached to a collar she could now see clearly. The leash ran from the dog back around the curve she'd just come around, pulled taut at a slight upward angle, the end of it out of sight behind the bend. Someone was holding the other end. Around the curve. She could not see who, and she could not hear anyone. She stopped running. The dog looked at her with the settled, alert expression of a dog that is doing exactly what it has been told to do, and then it sat, exactly the way it had the first time. She'd encountered it with that same smooth, practiced descent, not the abrupt drop of a dog responding to a sharp command, but the fluid movement of an animal that has performed this action enough times that it requires no thought. Its attention stayed completely fixed on her dot, the leash stayed taut. Whoever was around the bend was holding it with deliberate tension. They knew the dog had stopped. They could feel that through the leash. They knew something was in front of. The dog dot, she understood it then. Not gradually, not as a building suspicion all at once, the way a picture snaps into focus. The dog had been there that first time, not because it had gotten loose, not because its owner was careless. It had been placed there in the middle of the path, specifically because runners slow down for dogs. Because a dog sitting in the trail creates a moment of pause, a distraction, a reason to look forward rather than behind. Because while she was looking at the dog and deciding how to get around it, she hadn't been looking at anything else. The first encounter had been the test. The second was the trap dot. She turned around. The man was 10 feet behind her. The same man from before, same gray athletic gear, same medium build, same face that had given her the embarrassed laugh of an apologetic dog owner 30 minutes ago. He was not jogging. He was not walking casually. He was standing completely still in the way that has nothing to do with rest, the stillness of someone who has arrived at a position and is waiting to see what the other person does first. His right hand was at his side, and there was something in it, something she couldn't see clearly because of the angle and the way the afternoon light came through the canopy. The size of a fist, maybe slightly longer. She could not get a better look without stepping toward him. His face held no readable expression. Not aggression, not excitement, not the self-conscious awareness of someone who knows they've been caught doing something wrong. Nothing. A blank attentiveness that was somehow more frightening than any specific emotion would have been. She was 30 minutes from the trailhead. She was at the section of the path she'd always loved most. There was No one within sight in any direction. The dog was in front of her, with its leash going around the bend. The man was 10 feet behind her. Both directions of the trail were accounted for. She screamed, not for any strategic reason. Just her body did it. Loud, raw, the kind of sound that doesn't sound like her doc. It startled him. She saw it, a slight backward flinch, a shift in his weight. She ran left. Not down the trail, not toward the dog, but left into the grass. And she hit the fence line at a jog and followed it until she found the gap she'd been right. There was a gap, a section where the chain link had separated from its post and been pushed back enough for a person to squeeze through. She went through it without stopping. Sidewalk. A real street. 2 cars parked at the curb, one moving slowly toward an intersection 20 feet away. She ran down the center of the sidewalk. Her lungs were burning and she could taste something. Metallic, and the chemical smell was still there, faint but present, in her sinuses in a way it hadn't been before. Her left shoe had come partially unlaced and she couldn't feel her hands properly. She didn't look back. She ran a full block before. She let herself look. Nothing behind her. Empty sidewalk. She kept running. There was a woman in a driveway on the next block, lifting grocery bags from the trunk of her car. Renata went directly to her. She said something afterward she genuinely couldn't reconstruct exactly what. Some combination of trail and man and please. But whatever she said, and whatever her face looked like, was enough. The woman took one look at her and said, "Get inside." Inside, door locked. 911 called. Renata sitting on a stranger's couch with a glass of water she didn't drink, trying to give a description of a man whose face she could still picture perfectly, but whose features she found almost impossible to translate into words. Officers searched the trail. No one found. The dog, the leash, the man, gone. As if the whole configuration had just folded up and left. They found a piece of paper on the trail surface, folded in quarters, near approximately where she'd been standing when she turned around. The responding officer mentioned it in his report. He described it as blank, except for a small hand-drawn symbol in the lower corner. He did not specify what the symbol was, and she did not ask. She has not asked since. The investigation produced no suspect. No trail cameras covered that section of the corridor. A partial physical description was entered into the system. The detective assigned to it called her once, 3 weeks later, to tell her there was nothing actionable to pursue. He said it in the tone of someone delivering a routine update, not an apology. What she came back to, over and over, was the dog. You don't train a dog to do that on accident. You don't train a dog to approach a moving runner, position itself in the center of the trail, and sit in a calm, stable hold with other stimuli present, traffic sounds, unfamiliar smells, a stranger's. Approach not as a one-time thing, and not through casual ownership. That behavior, performed cleanly and without visible stress in an open-air environment, takes time, repetition. Someone has to run that sequence again and again until the dog performs it reliably. Someone had to decide that was worth doing, which meant this had been practiced, which meant there had almost certainly been a before other trails, other runners, other days when it had either worked or had almost worked or had been a rehearsal for something that hadn't been attempted yet. She thought about the paper on the trail. She thought about it more than she thought about the man's face, more than she thought about the chemical smell, more than she thought about anything else from that afternoon. A folded piece of paper placed in a specific location with a symbol on it, not dropped by accident, left deliberately. She didn't know if it had been left for her or had been there before she arrived, which was, in some ways, worse. She moved out of her apartment 2 months later, not because of the trail specifically. The trail was miles from where she lived. But because she'd started thinking about all the routes she'd run through the city in those 8 months, all the journal entries she'd kept about her own routines and patterns, and she kept arriving at the same uncomfortable image. What that legible, consistent, documented life would look like to someone watching it from the outside. A map, a schedule, a reliable sequence of behaviors, written down by its own subject. She lives in a different part of the city now. She runs on a treadmill or on a busy waterfront promenade during mid-morning hours. She misses the converted rail trail. She misses the gold light through the live oaks at 5 in the afternoon. That specific quality of it she'd never quite found anywhere else in the city. She did eventually try to identify the chemical smell. She cross-referenced descriptions online, narrowed it to a few candidates, spent an hour going through possibilities with the kind of careful focus she normally applies to client briefs. She stopped searching when she found the most likely match. She said it wasn't something you would use for mechanical work. She didn't say what it was for.